Izuku didn't have to do much to convince his mom to let him get a teaching degree, and she even encouraged it since he liked teaching in the red light districts. He was given a round of congratulations from everyone in the South Side when he spilled that he had graduated. He had to actively dissuade them from quickly throwing him a party down at the community center. Finishing up for the day, he went to his apartment complex to meet up with Mezzo-kun. The two of them had grown tentatively closer as they spoke of how to test his quirk's capabilities. Izuku was consistently worrying about overstepping boundaries whenever he asked about testing his quirk. But Mezzo-kun has been very reassuring throughout it all, and he did tell Izuku when he was crossing a line. Izuku had only done so once with the dismemberment question when they first met, and they refrained from touching that topic for now as neither was comfortable with exploring the idea. That being said, Izuku had found himself very fascinated with Mezzo-kun's quirk and what he could actually do with it. Like right now, he was sitting in Mezzo-kun's room examining a snout-shaped mouth full of long human canines. This is incredible work, Mezzo-kun. Your ability to manipulate bone matter is getting so much better. Can you widen the base of your jawbones like a crocodile? He inquired, tapping one of the fang-like canines. I can. He responded, and the snout-like mouth changed to be more V-shaped. That's great, Mezzo-kun. Have you made any progress with your imitation? Izuku said, gently pressing on the base to feel the difference in the jawbones. The boy brought his hand-mouth closer to Izuku. Sort of. I'm still working on it, but I'm almost close to mimicking your voice. He explained, the voice coming from his hand almost the same pitch as his own. That's okay, Mezzo-kun. Don't forget to work on your inflections though. They're just as important as an accent. Izuku told him with a pat on the boy's shoulder. What about the other thing? Have you been able to make your skin thicker or a different texture? He asked, since Mezzo-kun had mentioned he had been working on it in their latest text chain. Mezzo-kun rubbed the back of his neck. I can make it thicker, but I still haven't been able to make anything like scales or feathers. He admitted, changing the mouth in Izuku's hands to another hand with visibly thick skin. Izuku hummed back and lightly pressed against the thicker skin to see if he could still feel the bones and joints. That might be too big of a leap. You might try growing your hair as if it's fur first, Izuku suggested, watching as the skin became less thick and he started sprouting tufts of hair. Yeah, like that, Mezzo-kun. He encouraged with a grin. Izuku and Mezzo-kun continued talking for a bit before he left to stay in one of the other units for the night. While he was on good terms with the Shojis, Izuku didn't want to impose or make Shoji-san feel pressured to let him stay since he was her boss. Izuku walked with both Mezzo-kun and Masao-san to the station the next morning, and he was able to say bye to them both before he jumped onto his train to Aomori. Honestly, Saturday was probably his favorite day other than Sunday at this point. Hitchhiking across Hokkaido was a very active process, and he enjoyed how hands-on he could get with it. Hokkaido was still the best-looking prefecture red light district-wise, and it was getting prettier as it began to snow. Stepping off the train at Shibuya Station, Izuku was torn between taking a picture of scenery or a video so he can get everything he wanted to show his mom. Leaning more towards a video, he decided to give himself a few minutes to take a nice video for her. Hiwa had some nice clearings right by the forest. It wasn't that much of a trek, they're taking half hour at most, and he had already taught his 4 hours in Otaru, so it should probably be okay. He spotted one of many rabbit quirked people he'd become used to seeing wherever he went, and Izuku nodded to them. It might have been 2 months at most since he helped Amiko, but with how abundant the Vespa family was, Izuku would probably be more worried if he hadn't seen them. The only times he didn't was when something happened in the area, big hero raids, firefights, etc., that resulted in quite a bit of damage. So Izuku, with all the wisdom that comes from hindsight, found himself grateful when he saw them, if only for his peace of mind. And wasn't that an outrageous thought? Midoriya Izuku, a boy who has always dreamed of being a hero and having been bullied by just about everyone for being quirkless, finding comfort and relief from being not quite stalked by a major mafia group? Maybe there was some truth to when some of his ex-classmates said his life was some kind of joke. Moral quandaries aside, Izuku busied himself by hurrying over to the first clearing he could find and started getting ready to record himself in the field of snow. As Izuku tended to do when he spoke, it was a touch awkward at the beginning as he didn't quite know where to start. Slowly he fell into rambling about his work in the area or his classes that day. Near the end of the video, He made some promises that he'd show her the spots he liked if they ever found the time for a trip together. Izuku sent the video off to his mom, and he went on to add Hiwa to the ever-growing list of places to bring mom. A list that had a life of its own, as he never found a shortage of cool little areas that he thought his mom would love to visit, and as smart as Izuku was constantly being told he was, he did not think he had an eidetic memory and needed to write the places down. He was 50% sure he didn't anyway. Izuku had just put his phone away and was going to start heading back to the city when an odd sensation suddenly washed over him. The feeling left him nauseous and his legs weaker, making him shakily take a step back to better ground himself. It worked for all of 10 seconds as a second wave of the sensation caused him to fall onto his bottom. As a dull ringing made itself known in his ears, Izuku couldn't help panicking over what was going on. Okay, okay, okay. Don't panic, Izuku. Do not panic. You need to get a hold of yourself. He mentally told himself, trying to force his breathing to become even again. Izuku was successful in wrangling his lungs into order, but his heart just wasn't cooperating, maybe a side effect of what was causing this. He thought, crawling over towards the tree line. But what is this? It can't be something I ate. I had the same thing for lunch I do every time I come here, and it didn't taste off. A quirk, maybe? Is that tree moving? He mentally questioned, watching the branches of the tree he planned to use to get back on his feet. Izuku's vision had to be affected as well, because that was the only explanation for the way the limbs were twisting. Whatever quirk this is, it is definitely mental. But why am I being hit by anyone's quirk? I haven't gotten in between any local gang fights, and the Kitsune Fangs didn't have members or territory this far north. He thought as he got himself to his feet, leaning on the tree for complete support. Maybe I haven't been as careful as I thought I was with my work? Did someone accidentally let it slip to all for one that Deku Sensei was a two-toes? He fearfully wondered, his eyes darting around for any people-shaped figures. He didn't see anyone, but his eyes weren't completely trustworthy at the moment. Izuku would have tried to call for help, but he doubted he could properly dial the buttons, and he was about to risk yelling for one of the Vespas when he heard the snap of a branch echoing in his ears along with the ringing. He whipped his head towards the noise and caught a glimpse of gray and dark green. Izuku stumbled after the figure, falling over into the snow at least 3 times, and the closer he got, the more his vision distorted, and the ringing became sharper. After a few minutes he caught up enough to see just who the figure was. A small striped dark green young boy with gray hair, a tail, and brown horns stood across from him, and unlike everything else, Izuku could see the boy clearly. He could see the panic in the boy's eyes as he pressed himself against a tree that was bent in half and his chest practically heaving. Izuku's head started to throb as he stared at the kid and was barely stringing together that he had to be under the kid's quirk when the kid ran off again. Wait. Izuku croaked out, following the boy through the twisted and warped forest. Izuku fell a couple more times and the kid threw some snow in his face before he could reach the boy. Hey, calm down. He tried to say, but the kid reared up and almost slashed Izuku with his clawed fingers. Let me go. The boy screeched, desperately trying to pull his other arm out of Izuku's hand. Izuku released the boy's arm and raised both of his in surrender. Oh okay. IW won't touch you. But please don't run off. He requested, watching the boy scramble away from him, and the boy pressed himself against another warped tree. It was probably due to Izuku's previous experience dealing with being, well, a mess that allowed him to function with his screwed up senses as well as he did. And while Izuku could stay on his feet, he decided to conserve his energy and let himself sit down in the snow. Are you okay? Why were you running? Izuku asked, having seen how scared the boy was. Maybe he's scared of getting in trouble from using his quirk in public? He considered it because of the side effects of the boy's quirk. IJ just wanted T to stop. The boy mumbled, body shivering as he hugged himself, and as concerned Izuku was over what he said. Izuku could see the boy wasn't dressed for the weather, missing anything that could be considered a coat or boots. Izuku unzipped his coat and offered it to the boy. Here. Izuku told him, hoping he wasn't making a fool of himself by grossly misjudging where he was in relation to the boy. The boy might have been out longer than Izuku could have thought as the boy hesitated for a few seconds before he quickly walked over to Izuku. The kid was around 5 to 6, so the coat that was big on Izuku easily swamped the boy, and the cold nipped where it could, leaving Izuku a touch more aware and helped him keep his lunch where it belonged, in his stomach. Thanks. The boy muttered, burying himself into Izuku's coat. It's nothing. Don't want you to get sick. I'm Deku Sensei. He responded and introduced himself, hoping it would prompt the boy to tell him his name in return, Kaoru. He said back. Izuku nodded his head, probably lopsided, and asked, "It's nice to meet you, Kaoru-kun. Is this the first time this has happened?" Kaoru nodded, moving to sit closer to Izuku. "Do you know what triggered your quirk?" he asked, since it was common for quirk accidents to happen at Kaoru's age. The boy blinked, taken aback, as he stared at Izuku, confused. Izuku's vision became a touch less murky, at the same time as Kaoru asked, What? This isn't my quirk. My quirk is a mutation." Izuku looked back at the boy, himself confused, but quickly understood what Kaoru meant. The kid must have thought his odd features were the extent of his quirk, and that wasn't an uncommon misconception. Only 1 out of 5 mutation quirks have abilities considered unrelated to the physical mutations the person gained. Kaoru-kun mutation quirk C can have abilities that are separate from physical changes. He explained, and the boy ducked his head, the tree branches becoming even more gnarled and twisted before he hesitantly looked around at how warped the world around them was. I'm causing this? Kaoru timidly asked, curling into himself in Izuku's coat. Any doubt Izuku had before was quashed by how everything warped and changed with Kaoru's emotions. Probably, but that's okay, Kaoru-kun. You're still young and accidents happen. Izuku assured, his hand moving to pat the boy's head, but he stopped halfway. I'm sorry. How do I make it stop? Kaoru asked, looking like he was about to cry. Izuku's vision getting so bad his own body was starting to also get distorted. Kaoru-kun, you don't have to apologize. This was just an accident. You'll learn how to control it eventually. Let's focus on C, calming down and work from there. Izuku told him, using his hands to keep from falling over as he was losing his equilibrium. Try to follow my breathing, Kaoru-kun. Izuku instructed, making his breathing loud enough for the boy to hear, then used a grounding exercise to keep Kaoru relaxed, and the more they spoke, the less warped and twisted the world became. After that, Izuku went on to tell Kaoru about the places he's been. A few minutes later, the world was back to normal, though Izuku continued for a few minutes before mentioning it. I think we're good now, Kaoru-kun. Do you think you can walk to town? Izuku asked, wobbly, getting to his feet, feeling slightly lightheaded as he watched the boy trying to stand up himself. Kaoru was able to stand up, but Izuku didn't like how unsteady he was on his feet, likely due to quirk exhaustion as well as being cold. I can carry you, Kaoru-kun. You shouldn't force yourself to walk. He offered, crouching down to the boy. Kaoru nervously shuffled a bit before nodding. Oh, okay. He muttered. Izuku happily scooped the young boy into his arms. All right, now where was I? I think I was talking about my friend Kiku-kun, right? He asked, following his large and obvious tracks in the snow. Chapter 32. Cold Comfort. It hadn't taken long for Izuku to reach the tree line, and Izuku was slightly glad because he was worried he was going to start boring little Kaoru with his rambling. Oh, I'm sorry for not asking earlier, but what were you doing in the forest, Kaoru-kun? Izuku inquired. The boy might have some resistance to the cold from his quirk, but Izuku doubted any half-decent parent would just let their kid run around without shoes. And he would know, considering how many questionable parents he's come to know in his work in red lights. Kaoru buried his face in Izuku's shoulder. I was on a class field trip. He answered, a field trip, huh? Let's go find your group then. Your teacher must be worried after you disappeared. Izuku responded as he reached the other end of the clearing. Kaoru didn't say anything in reply, but Izuku's attention was caught by one of his many rabbit-quirked people following him. Izuku normally didn't interact with the Vespas outside of when the younger Vespas joined his lessons, but the woman would no doubt either know where Kaoru's class was or could at least help him find them. Excuse me, miss. Izuku called out, moving to meet the woman halfway. The woman had already seemed to be looking for him, so he hadn't needed to do much to get her attention. You doing all right, Deku-sensei? She asked, skipping formalities, and she seemed just as concerned with the child he was carrying. Yeah, a bit cold, but I'm more concerned about getting him back to his class. Have you heard anything about that? Izuku questioned, walking along with the woman. One of her ears flicked as she hummed back. Might have heard the group you're looking for earlier, but didn't hear anything about a missing kid. She commented, and that made Izuku frown. As much as he adored children, he wasn't naive to how mean kids could be. His time in school was an excellent example of how cruel people could be regardless of age, and considering how Kaoru was when he found him, and the lack of concern was painting an unfortunate picture for him. Well, that sounds like a great place to start. Mind leading the way? He requested. Not at all, Deku-sensei. She replied, leading him away. Kaoru hadn't spoken much, though Izuku still tried to keep an eye on him and help him stay calm, so he didn't accidentally trigger his quirk again. Izuku couldn't say that his unease went away when he did find Kaoru's class. The two women he believed to be supervising the trip weren't as worried as he expected, considering they had a child missing for half an hour at least. How could they be so calm? Kaoru was not an easy child to overlook or lose in winter with his mutations. He glanced at his Lepus companion, and she looked at the group before returning his gaze with a raised eyebrow. Izuku nodded, then the two approached the group of around 11. Hello. Ma'am, are you missing one of your kids? He questioned, getting just about everyone's attention. The women both seemed to jump when he spoke and turned towards him abruptly. Oh no, not at all. The first woman assured with a dismissive wave of her hand. So Kaoru-kun here isn't one of your kids? Izuku pressed one of his hands, coming up to rough Kaoru's hair. In an instant both women paled. W. The other said, turning around to check the kids. The first woman quickly walked over to Izuku, an apology slipping from her lips. I'm so sorry. I don't know how he could have gotten away from us. I hope he hasn't caused you that much trouble. The woman held her arms out as if she expected Izuku to just hand the boy over to her. He just gave her a tight-lipped smile back and softly tightened his hold on Kaoru. One of you has the number for Kaoru-kun's guardians, right? He asked. His voice purposely kept neutral, not wanting to accidentally upset Kaoru. Kids were easily affected when adults started arguing, and Kaoru was already gripping his jacket. Izuku did not doubt that Kaoru wanted to be swallowed up by the ground from how he tried to make himself as small as possible in Izuku's arms. What? Why? This isn't the first time Ito-san has run off before, and I can assure you that his mother will be informed of this once she comes to collect him. The woman responded. Izuku did not like the way the woman said that, and he could now feel Kaoru's claws digging into his sides, as sharp as his little claws were. They were hardly painfully enough to faze him, and he didn't so much as flinch. Well, I'm sure she'd like to know about Kaoru-kun's new quirk development right away, don't you think? He sweetly replied, with his head tilted and his hand going back to playing with Kaoru's hair to distract him. Q quirk development? She sputtered, and Izuku grinned back at her. I know. Only a fifth of mutation quirk develops special abilities. So, we need to call his mom now so I can help her take the proper steps to help little Kaoru-kun. He gleefully told her. So if you would so kindly tell me Kaoru-kun's mother's number? Izuku prompted, slightly readjusting his hold on Kaoru so the boy would be more comfortable. The flustered woman balked and fumbled over her words to the point Izuku could only make out syllables. Well, ma'am, if you can't give me her number, I'm sure we are more than capable of finding Kaoru-kun's mom ourselves. I'm sure a smart boy like Kaoru-kun can remember where he lives. Izuku interrupted and quickly turned his back on the woman. The second woman backtracked hard and prattled off the mother's number. Izuku smiled, nodded back at her, and continued to leave, ignoring both women's protests. Honestly, if he didn't have Kaoru in his arms or a Vespa by his side, Izuku was sure he would have crumbled in front of them. However, the way Kaoru relaxed in his hold as soon as they left was enough to crush any doubts Izuku had about his actions. Those women aren't very nice to you, are they, Kaoru-kun? Izuku asked, and the boy nodded. Not really. He muttered into his shoulder. Izuku raised Kaoru higher up and encouraged him to wrap his arms around his neck, which the boy hesitantly did before returning his face to Izuku's shoulder. I'll have to mention that to your mom when we discuss your lessons. Izuku mused. Kaoru raised his head and blinked. My what? He questioned, staring up at the greenette, confused. Izuku nodded with a soft hum. Of course, if I'm going to help you learn to use your quirk, I need to talk to your mom about how to go about it. Izuku responded, and Kaoru gaped at him. You're going to help me? Just like that? He asked, shocked. Izuku just smiled back at the boy. Aha. Your quirk is going to need a lot of work, so you'll need all the help you can get, Kaoru-kun. I'll only be here Saturdays, but you and your mom will be able to call me if anything happens. He answered simply enough, leaving the boy speechless. Izuku then focused on calling up Kaoru's mom and explaining the events of the last hour. Meeting Kaoru's mom was thankfully uneventful, and she was rightfully furious when he explained the supervisor's lackluster actions. Izuku was also glad that Kaoru's mental quirk wasn't some random evolution and she'd get him help from his grandparents. He still offered to help when he was in Haiwa, and he was able to get permission once he told her about his degree. Izuku made his goodbyes to the two after working out when he'd come by and sneakily patching up the cuts from Kaoru's claws in their bathroom. He went on to finish his rounds in the districts of Haiwa before making his way to the docks. Izuku knew he was behind his schedule by over an hour, but he held out hope that he just might make it to the last ferry before it leaves. However, upon reaching the closed terminal, that hope was dashed, and he sighed. Izuku sat himself down on a bench and opened his phone to search for a hotel for the night while calculating how to get home as fast as possible once he takes the first ferry in the morning. He was about to book a room when a voice called out from behind him, Midoriya. Izuku squeaked, jumping to his feet and taser in hand as he whirled around towards who spoke. Upon seeing the familiar tall pale figure, his shoulders slumped and he lowered his taser. Oh god. Yuri-san, what are you doing here? Izuku asked, putting away his weapon. I had business in Hakodate and thought I might be able to catch you before you left. He answered, and Izuku found that to be a reasonable explanation considering his job. But when Valentine informed me, you missed the last boat. I became worried. He explained, concern lacing his tone. Oh, that. I got caught up helping a boy that discovered his quirk, and well. Izuku replied, gesturing to nothing in particular. I see. Yuri-san said, walking around the bench to stand beside him. Would you perhaps like to join me on my boat back to Aomori then? He softly offered, his hands behind his back. Izuku blinked and brought his hand to his chin as he pondered the option and whether or not he trusted the Russian enough to take a cruise with him. Jumping onto a mobster's vehicle for an undetermined amount of time shouldn't be so tempting, but if he was being honest, Yuri-san has had plenty of opportunities to get rid of him if he wanted to. Izuku put his phone away and told Yuri-san, yeah, that sounds okay. Lead the way, Yuri-san. Then he followed the man to a ship that was easily 15 meters in length. Yuri-san, that's not a boat. That's a yacht. Izuku pointed out. The man shrugged with one shoulder. Yacht, boat, they both float. And commercial vessels aren't quite made for people such as myself. Yuri-san replied, brushing it off. Well, Izuku couldn't argue with that. Yuri-san's quirk aside, he was an easy 9.5 feet tall and he had the money to pay for the comfort of not ducking his head to enter, so he just nodded and followed him on board. Come, I'm sure you've yet to have dinner, we can eat in the cabin, Midoriya. Yuri-san said, hand hovering behind Izuku's back. Izuku was going to turn him down, but the rumbling of his stomach betrayed him. That would be great, Yuri-san. He responded, both resigned and a touch embarrassed at his own body outing him, letting the man guide him below deck and sitting beside Yuri-san. Well, he was within 2 feet of the man, which was the closest he managed so far, so Izuku counted it as a win. Yuri-san was presumably texting whoever was making them food. He rarely paid attention to anything other than Izuku when the boy was around, which was always something that made Izuku feel off, for lack of a better word. Izuku never specifically felt unsafe around Yuri-san, but anyone that had a clear interest and focus on him in particular always set off alarms in his head. Yuri-san, he said, getting the man's attention. Yes, Midoriya? Yuri-san responded, turning to him. What do you want from me? Izuku asked, in a rare moment of brazenness, making Yuri-san blink, staring at him in what Izuku believed was confusion. Pardon? He questioned, and Izuku ducked his head, rubbing the back of his neck. Izuku generally glossed over this looming feeling, but the closer they seemed to get made it all the more glaring for him. And maybe it was a side effect of the years of bullying and isolation, but the idea of anyone wanting to be around him was something he just couldn't understand. His mom, the Bakugos, were family, and families were supposed to love each other. The people in the red light districts tolerated him because they had a mostly symbiotic relationship, where he helps them, and they let him do what he needs to so he can help. But he couldn't think of anything that Yuri-san could possibly gain from associating with him. Izuku himself hadn't been that close to Anya-san and Yukiko-chan, so Izuku couldn't blame it on that, and with how well-informed Yuri-san was, he severely doubted the man wanted Izuku to teach him anything. Yuri-san simply had 100 different resources he could blatantly take advantage of in an international enterprise to run, so he seriously doubted Yuri-san had the time to waste entertaining some kid. You've got a lot of things to do, so why do you hang out with me? Izuku rephrased his question, do I need a reason? Yuri-san asked, and Izuku felt one of his eyes twitch at his deflection. Yes. He exclaimed, people don't just talk to me, just because. Izuku countered, feeling that it was a valid argument. Yuri-san did not agree with that sentiment. Yuri-san's face twisted in an emotion Izuku couldn't quite identify as he exhaled and leaned back into his seat, more lightly rubbing his forehead. Midoriya, for all I am, I'm still as human as you are. He told the Greenette, and for as long as I've been around, most of my life hasn't always been so kind to me, he confessed, getting a distant look in his eyes before his eyes focused on him again. Yuri-san huffed. I can confidently say the last 50 or so years has mostly been the best of my life, because I've never had anyone I could consider as family before. He further admitted being oddly vulnerable with Izuku, which made Izuku unsure of how to feel. On one hand, he wanted to comfort Yuri-san regardless of the risk of frostbite, but on the other hand, Izuku wanted to question why Yuri-san would share such personal information with him. Friends or not, they were simply not at the point of revealing things like that. And personally, Midoriya, I'm not ready to let go of that feeling, and while we're not blood, after everything you've done for my child and my little Vienuka, I do consider you something like family. Yuri-san said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. Izuku's heart stopped and his mind stalled. His chest was uncomfortably tight from the idea. Izuku had come to terms with Yuri-san being his friend, but the man actually having some kind of attachment to him? That straight up did not compute in his mind. It was even kind of scary. And not because of Yuri-san's job. If Izuku still had a serious problem with that, Izuku would have tried to cut ties as politely as he could months ago. No, it was just the fact that someone outside of family genuinely liked him enough to want him around. Izuku also found himself heavily questioning himself, because this had come completely out of left field in his perspective. Normal people don't declare others family for no reason. Izuku was even about to fall into a downward spiral of whether or not he needed to completely re-evaluate all of his relationships with, well, everyone, when an icy cold hand brought him out of his thoughts. Yuri-san had removed his hand only a few seconds later, but it's certainly long enough to leave Izuku rattled. I understand that you do not think of me that way, Midoriya, and that is fine. I am still mostly a stranger to you, and it would be very presumptuous of me to just insert myself into your life. Yuri-san calmly told him, which was oddly reassuring, mainly in the fact he wouldn't be expected to play house with Yuri-san. I also understand this information might make you uncomfortable and that you probably don't want to keep seeing me. He added sympathetically, but Izuku, despite his inner turmoil, rejected the idea. Yuri-san, regardless of his career choices, was someone who Izuku had come to think of as a good friend. He understood not wanting to let go of a good friend. His rapidly deteriorating relationship with Kachan was an excellent example of his inability to let go of people, so perhaps that is why Izuku was about to entertain the devil's advocate option and quietly asked, what if I did? Have a reason? Yuri-san's eyes locked on Izuku. What kind of reason? He questioned, eyes narrowed, and Izuku awkwardly twiddled his thumbs. Well, like if we had a deal? I come to see you and you teach me more Russian? Izuku tentatively suggested, mentally fumbling as he was the one taking charge for once. Well, other than seeking out the Urarakas, it probably was. Yuri-san stared at him, making him doubt himself. Is that what you want, Midoriya? He pressed, and Izuku timidly nodded, making him raise his brow. I'm certain, Yuri-san. Izuku assured, his hand going to rub some heat friction into the joint to counter Yuri-san's lingering chill. It didn't work, but it never hurts to try. Yuri-san brought his hand up to point at Izuku's affected shoulder and twirled one finger, somehow drawing the cold out of his body and condensing it to a small marble of ice. Izuku watched on transfixed, having never seen Yuri-san use his quirk before. I believe we have a deal then, Midoriya. Yuri-san said, dropping the shiny little marble into Izuku's hands. Izuku shakily nodded before turning his eyes to the marble, and he examined it in utter fascination. His concerns over his friendship with Yuri-san weren't completely nullified, but he wasn't quite in the right frame of mind to process the full implications of this development. So, for now, he would just go with the flow and wondered if he'd be able to get the marble home before it melted. Chapter 33. Window of Opportunity. Magna knew she was in for a rough trip through life as soon as she figured out that she was female. Calling her parents unsupportive would have been underplaying it, and they had both rigorously tried to get her to be more masculine and be a normal boy. Suffice to say, she got into many arguments with them until she finally left when she was 18. She didn't mind joining any sports or the boys' activities, but Magna wanted them to acknowledge who she was and let her join activities she wanted to be a part of. Honestly, it was hard to believe that people could still be so transphobic in the Quirk era, but here were her parents refusing to let her wear anything that they considered a feminine color. Their prejudices even went as far as refusing to let her learn household chores or cooking, and if it weren't for some half-decent guys on the football team she joined, she wouldn't know how to feed herself or do the dishes. If she tried to watch either of them at home, it would lead to arguments or punishments. Moving out, she hadn't had much to her name, but not having to deal with her parents daily had greatly reduced the stress on her, and since she was an adult, she got her name changed as soon as financially possible, which of course led to the biggest hissy fit her parents have ever thrown, and Magna was left with no choice but to sever all contact with them. And boy, they didn't like that, and borderline harassed her about changing it back and getting her to stop with her little phase. Magna had to move prefectures twice just to get away from them, something that cost a ton of money each time, and it made getting a job much harder. She didn't have much in the way of experience, and with only a high school diploma, so she couldn't get any jobs that paid much. Magna also swore she had the worst luck with employers because 3 out of 5 were transphobic. None of them were on the same level as her parents, but that wasn't exactly a high bar of praise. Take her current ex-boss for example. He ran a bar, and she was a bartender for him, but when one of the drunks known for giving girls trouble complained, she found herself being fired mid-shift. Didn't matter, she was one of his most reliable people. The fact she identified as a woman was enough for that prick. She hardly had time to grab her bag before he tossed her out on her ass. Tired of her god-awful days, she turned around and spent a good amount of time cursing the prick and his bloody business. Once she ran out of steam, the world responded to her dramatics by snowing. She ran a hand through her hair to get it out of her face and started to trudge back to her apartment when a familiar voice called out, "Maggie?" Turning around, she saw Shoji Yua, a woman with a spider mutation that had been generous enough to let her stay in her apartment for a couple of months 3 years ago. "Oh, hey Yua. It's been a while." She greeted, a bit bashful at being caught in such a low state by the woman. Yua and her son were hard to forget, and not just because of their quirks. The Shojis were good people, and they were kind enough to her when she stayed with them. That kindness hadn't left her as the woman quickly walked over to her and began fussing over her. "Oh Maggie, are you alright? How'd you get caught up in this mess without a coat?" Yua questioned, one of her hands helping to brush off the snow from her shoulders. "I'm fine Yua, I just got off of work and forgot to grab my coat when I left." Magna told her, and it wasn't a lie. She had forgotten her coat when she rushed out of the apartment. "Oh you poor dear, come let's get you out of the cold," Yua said, already trying to lead her away, but Magna brushed her off. "Nah, I'll be fine once I get home. You don't have to trouble yourself over me. Lil Mez is probably waiting for you." Magna responded by moving to pull away. Yua was deceptively strong despite her spindly frame, and she was very much not letting go of Magna. "As if I'd let you go home alone like this. Besides, Mezzo is 13 and his friend is very capable, so I trust they can be alone for a few hours," she told the redhead, and Magna sighed. As nice as it was to hear that the kid made a friend, she knew that she'd have no chance of Yua letting her go. Magna guided Yua to her hole-in-the-wall apartment. It wasn't the nicest place she's ever lived, and her neighbors could certainly do one, but it beat living on the streets, especially with how much harder it was to insulate an abandoned place. She couldn't say she was embarrassed at Yua seeing her place. The apartment the three of them lived in years ago had one bed and a rat problem, something fierce, so this apartment wasn't that horrible. Magna kicked off her boots and trudged over to the fridge that wasn't much better than a cooler to grab a bottle of cheap wine. I don't have much in the way of hospitality, but I can at least offer you a glass, Yua. She offered, managing to dig up 2 clean cups to drink from, and sat down on her couch. Yua was silent for a moment. I suppose I can have a glass, Yua said, sitting down beside her. The two women began to talk about the things that had happened in the 3 years since they'd seen each other. Yua nursed her mug of wine while Magna freely drank most of the bottle. Getting just a touch tipsy, she, unfortunately, spilled about the recent drama in her life and how she would likely have to find somewhere else to stay in a month because she lost her job due to her asshole of a boss. A couple of hours later, Yua helped her into her bed and she'd wake up the next morning with a slight hangover. A more clear-minded Magna had regretted pouring her guts out to the woman and then got her shit together so she could try to get a new job. A week later found Magna getting herself as cleaned up as soon as possible as she waited for Yua to come to escort her to an interview. Her job search was less than fruitful, so it was a bit of a godsend when Yua had showed up out of the blue yesterday. She knew a bakery by her building being built and offered to arrange an interview for her since Yua knew the owner. She wouldn't lie, she was nervous, but this wasn't the normal nerves as Yua had gone out of her way to set this up and she didn't want to disappoint her. Yua was a nice person that Magna would love to be gal pals with, which is why she didn't want to muck this up. Magna couldn't remember the last time she had fun hanging out with anyone, even if she'd been a sad drunk for half of it. When Yua arrived, she had been able to see right through her and had spent the walk to the south side reassuring her, so between Yua's attempts at pep talk and the drastic change environment, she couldn't find the time to worry. Like Magna knew the South Side was consistently rated the worst area in Japan for the last 50 years, but she sure as hell wasn't expecting the wreckage she was walking into. The only other areas she's seen this bad were the aftermath of hero-villain fights and pictures of places in the middle of a war. Yua expertly guided her through the district to a much cleaner-looking building that really stood out from its half-collapsed, half-burnt neighbor. All right, we're here now, Maggie. Ah, Midoriya-san is early, Yua commented, but when Magna searched for her future employer, couldn't find them. The only person she saw was a young brunette standing in front of the building. Well, there were other people, but Magna doubted they were who Yua was talking about, considering the woman promised the bakery had no direct ties to any criminal organizations, and when Yua began leading her towards the boy, she quickly caught on that the kid might be who Yua was talking about. Midoriya-san, Yua said, getting the boy's attention, and he put away the notebook he was writing in. The boy gave them a wave which confirmed that the kid was who her friend wanted her to meet. Shoji-san, I finished with Uraraka-san earlier than I thought I would. Oh, why, you must be Hakishi-san, yes? He told them once they were in front of the kid. She hoped that the boy didn't catch her wince at her last name. Judging by the way his eyes narrowed, he probably did. Yeah, I'm Hakishi Magna. I prefer going by my first name though, she answered, and Midoriya nodded. Of course, Magna-san. Shoji-san told me you have experience with baking. Have you worked in a bakery before? Midoriya inquired, quickly moving on from the name thing. Officially no. My aunt had one and I used to help out some when I was younger, Magna explained, rubbing the back of her head. She loved her aunt and working in her shop, but her mother hadn't ever gotten along with her sister due to her risque line of work outside the bakery. She hadn't seen her aunt since she was 10 due to a big blowout when her aunt gave her nail polish. And you know how to do the basics of taxes, right? Midoriya followed up, and Magna huffed. Yes, that's one of the few things my parents taught me before I left, she grumbled. Knowing how to balance finances was a suitable skill for men, and as much as they were being misogynistic about it, Magna was glad they were willing to teach her that. Good, good. We can discuss most of the details later when we sign the contract, Magna-san. The only other thing I need to ask now would be if you have a criminal record? Midoriya questioned, brushing past a lot of the questions. No, I don't have a record, she told him. She might have had trouble with the law before, but nothing bad enough to go on record. Great, I'll get the paperwork drawn up then. I can probably get it signed next week. The building is going to be painted today and tomorrow, so I'll show you around inside then as well. I look forward to working with you, Magna-san. Midoriya said with a clap beaming at her, and Magna admittedly felt that went over too well. That's it. Magna questioned, glancing at Yui, who just patted her on the back. Yep. Shoji-san said you're a great worker and that's good enough for me. I'm sorry if this is too brief. I'd love to go over more contract details with you, Magna-san, but I'm pretty busy today. I'll need to go soon to make it on time to my lessons. It was nice meeting Magna-san. Shoji-san can give you my contact details if you have any questions. Midoriya told her apologetically as he bowed before running off. She blinked, turning to her friend, wondering if that had really happened. He's been like that since he started traveling. Don't worry. Midoriya-san takes good care of his employees, Maggie. You're in good hands. Yui assured, a hand gently placed on her shoulder. Would you like to come over for lunch, Maggie? Mezzo wouldn't mind the company. Yui offered and Magna smiled back. Sure. I'd like to see how tall Lil Mez has gotten. She joked, lightly elbowing Yui. The two of them proceeded on to the nice-looking apartment building Yui worked and lived in. Chapter 34. A Day with Osamu. Izuku smiled as he finished printing out the contract for Magna-san in the Kumamoto University Library. Honestly, he was thankful to find one printer capable of connecting to his laptop, but surprised with how few connectable printers there were in the building. Well, he knew they weren't a common thing, but Izuku expected that there would be more in the university building. Mido-senpai, are you done yet? Osamu-kun asked, walking up to him with a couple of medical books in his arms. Yep. Did you find the books you needed? He asked, placing the papers away in his bag, and Osamu-kun nodded. Great, let's get to work then. You wanted to focus on learning more about the appendix, right? Izuku questioned, moving over to a table with the boy. Uh-huh. I know it's only guaranteed to be found in other two toes, but you said that some quirked individuals have been found with them too. Osamu-kun confirmed, sitting next to him. They have. Over 50% of people with a mutation quirk related to a herbivorous animal have been discovered to have the appendix. Biological anthropologists originally theorized the appendix's purpose might be connected to the herbivore diet our ancient ancestors could have had, so there is some grounding for those with vegetation-heavy diets to have an appendix. Izuku explained, opening one of the books. Together they happily learned as much as they could about the small organ in the next hour. This study session was something the two boys had done religiously every Tuesday before heading to another building for the EMT class Izuku had found for Osamu-kun. He had found the class simply to help Osamu-kun, but the boy had been too scared to go on his own, hence why Izuku accompanied the boy to his classes every Tuesday instead of his college courses. No doubt he was going to fall behind on his courses since he was losing a day every week, but learning more about medicine and helping Osamu-kun was more than worth it. Both boys had of course faced some difficulty from their classmates, due to not only their quirkless status but from being the youngest members of the class. That being said, it had somehow helped Izuku gain some measure of confidence from defending his and Osamu-kun's place in the class. Their teacher was willing to have them so long as they kept up with their payments, so it was just up to Izuku to make Osamu-kun feel safe there by keeping the rest of the people in the class away from the boy. Osamu-kun had taken to the classes like a fish to water and was loving it despite the endless amount of work they both had from it. The boy had also begun to call Izuku Mido-senpai. After he insisted the boy didn't have to call him by his alias, Izuku was both flustered and a touch honored when Osamu-kun argued that Izuku was his senpai and wouldn't drop the honorific. Standing outside of the room, Izuku reminded himself that if he could yell at gangsters, then he could deal with rude people well. I wasn't thinking the first time I did it, but the other 5 times worked out just fine. Even if it was only to not paint a target on themselves by crossing Yuri-san. Ritual mental pep talk done with, Izuku entered the classroom with Osamu-kun trailing right behind him. The two made their way to one of the 2-person desks and took note of the odd rubber human torso on the desk. Oh, do you think we're going to be doing CPR practice again, Mido-senpai? The brunette inquired, head tilted as he looked the dummy over. Maybe. Having exams to check our skills would probably be expected, but we could also be learning something else. Izuku answered himself, curious about what they could be learning today. Like what, Mido-senpai? Osamu-kun pondered and Izuku hummed. Well, he said one word before a man at the desk in front of them whirled around. Oh, would you two hollows stop fucking jabbering? He snapped at them, making Osamu-kun shrink back and press himself into Izuku's side. The greenette, however, stared back at the man shocked. While no one had been welcoming of them, Izuku didn't think anyone there would sink so low as to call them that slur. He squared his shoulders and glared at the blond man, not bothering to remember whatever his name was. What did you just call us? Izuku questioned, feeling slightly disgusted rather than the typical annoyance. To his credit, the blonde seemed to understand the gravity of what he just said and looked to the rest of the room. But for once the people in the room were clearly on Izuku's side. They probably wouldn't if the blonde called him any of the other numerous quirkless slurs. Hell, Izuku himself wouldn't care if he said something else like genless null. But publicly calling a quirkless person a hollow was a serious social faux pas and might be the only time the quirkless were allowed to retaliate, especially when it was directed at a child. Unfortunately, before he could, the instructor entered the room and noticed the tense air. The woman groaned. What happened this time? She questioned, not having any patience for the current drama. A woman with antlers standing beside the blonde immediately took a step away from him. Davidson called them. That. The woman told their teacher, pointing at an empty beaker, not wanting to risk becoming a social pariah by saying it herself. The teacher stared at the pair for a minute, and it took another example for her overworked brain to catch on, and she scowled. Davidson, out. The woman ordered. Rain sensei. The blonde tried to protest, only for the teacher to shoot him another scowl. I said out. I do not have the time or energy to deal with piss ants that spew bullcrap. Rain sensei said firmly. Davidson wisely shut up and left. Rain sensei was not a woman to cross, and as a working doctor, she had little patience for idiots. Osamu-kun tugged on Izuku's sleeve. Mido-senpai, did they help us? He whispered in utter disbelief, which was warranted considering both of the women were generally rude to them for being quirkless. Yes, what he said wasn't okay. Izuku told the boy, making him even more confused. But people have called us slurs all the time? Osamu-kun countered, and Izuku's heart twinged as he understood Osamu-kun's confusion. Izuku didn't know why that slur was different either until he was Osamu-kun's age. I'll explain it to you later. We should focus on Rain sensei right now. Izuku said, a hand on the boy's shoulder. Osamu-kun wanted to ask him about this magical slur that people couldn't call them, but let it rest and turned to Rain sensei. After they finished that day's class, Osamu-kun immediately plied him with questions about the slur. Izuku sighed and led him back to the library and away from prying eyes at a quiet, isolated corner, taking his phone out and opening a digital copy of a specific book before he explained a morbid event involving the MLA and the quirkless 75 years ago. He also explained that hollow was short for hollow blood, a slur that gained more traction due to how quirkless people were discovered to be more likely to have quirkless children regardless of their partner's quirk. Hollow itself wasn't a bad word, and it was used interchangeably with the other, evolutionary backwash, names quirkless people were given until around 75 years ago. Izuku also explained that people still called quirkless people hollows or hollow bloods, but that people just couldn't say it in public. He knew that was a weird point, but people just had strange rules for social situations, and calling a quirkless person hollow around other people in public was just one of the things that were against the rules of hospitality, or something. Osamu-kun seemed to understand what Izuku told him, even if the social hypocrisy didn't make much sense to him. That was about as much as Izuku could ask for, considering the reason for the odd social taboo was such a dark event in history, and he was glad he didn't have to deal with the emotional mess of a person he had been when his mom told him of the event. Osamu-kun had his number, so if he was affected by the knowledge, he'd call if he needed to talk about it. With that in mind, he went on with his rounds in the red light districts, teaching in one place and handing out care packages in all 5 of the districts. Izuku finished up placing some of the new fluffy materials in the same places he always did. He had learned how dangerous winter was for the less fortunate after the SSI, and he tried to do his best to help where he could. He didn't have property there yet, so Izuku had taken to buying large warm coats, warm gloves, large blankets, and easy-to-make warm food. He smiled, making sure the trunk was closed so weather and feral animals wouldn't get to the things he'd left there. Proud of himself, he nodded and was planning to leave when he was mobbed by a group of rabbit quirk children. Izuku was caught off guard and fell into the snow with a short cry of surprise. Izuku wanted to be at least somewhat annoyed by them tripping him up in the snow that got in between his clothes, making the boy wet and cold. But the small hill of excited children giggling and laughing from where they sat on top of him made it impossible. I apologize, Deku-sensei. Unfortunately, I think you know how hard it is to wrangle my brood. A woman with limp rabbit ears said, her arms crossed as she tiredly watched them. The kids didn't take too kindly to that, and more than one stuck their tongues out at her. Izuku tried his best to smile at her from where he was pinned on the ground. It's fine, Vespa-san. I completely understand. 15 toddlers are a handful. He playfully assured, not giving the kids any satisfaction when a few of them whacked him in retaliation. Not wanting to risk frostbite, Izuku sat up and caused the 5 kids that were on top of him to fall into the snow and their siblings around them. Whining was quick to come from those he displaced, making him have to cover his mouth to keep them from hearing him chuckle, but considering he was kicked in the ribs by one of the toddlers, he didn't know why he bothered trying to hide it with their hearing. One of the kids easily jumped up and onto Izuku's shoulder, gripping his coat to stay on there. We're having dinner at Nona's. Would you like to join us, Deku-sensei? She asked, making Izuku a bit tense. Well, I don't think I should just invite myself to someone else's house for dinner. He nervously deflected, looking to their mother. The girl started pouting. But Deku-sensei, I'm inviting you. She protested, and the rest of the siblings joined in and started telling him that they were inviting him to dinner. Izuku laughed awkwardly. That's very nice of you all. But I won't be going to your house, so I wouldn't be needing your permission. He explained, trying to keep from being overtaken by the toddlers again. Vespa-san thankfully stepped in at that moment by stomping her foot, Figly. She sternly called, causing the kids to stop their pleading and turn to her. If Deku-sensei doesn't already have plans, then I'm sure Nona would be happy to have him over. But we should be respectful of whatever choice he makes, right? Vespa-san questioned, her arms crossed. See, Mama. All 15 replied, their shoulders slumping, and those with upright ears had them matching their floppy-eared siblings. Izuku also had to catch the little girl who was clinging to his shoulder as she let go, and he didn't want her to hurt herself from falling that far. Naturally, being the very soft-hearted person he was, he couldn't stand all of the kids' melancholy, so against his better judgment he said, I wouldn't mind coming over for dinner, Vespa-san. The children of course burst into cheers and jumped him again, Figly. Vespa-san shouted, stomping her foot before giving up on getting any of them to calm down. She walked over and scooped up 5 of them into her arms. I'm sorry, Deku-sensei. They're incorrigible, but, unfortunately, the rest of the Figly will likely have the same reaction when we get to the compound. She tiredly apologized, quietly warning him of the onslaught of bunny children, no doubt waiting on the Vespa property. I understand, Vespa-san. Honestly, I'm more worried about eating your family's food. Izuku responded, getting 6 of the kids into his arms. A larger one sat on his shoulders and had a firm grip, pulling his hair. Izuku never liked it when anyone pulled his hair, but the boy's safety was always his priority. Besides, the kid's grip was nothing compared to that one mean girl from the 2nd grade. Vespa-san scoffed. Despite having over 400 people living at the compound, Mama always manages to make enough food for there to be leftovers, so don't worry about anyone going hungry over you. She commented, which Izuku found astounding. How could one woman make that much food without a quirk? His disbelief seemed to clear on his face, and Vespa-san rolled her eyes. Our family helps her, of course. She always has 20 helpers at any time. She added, making him sigh, relieved. Izuku managed to stand himself up without his hands and started the trek to the local Vespa compound, with the other 3 toddlers happily following the pair. Chapter 35. Magna needs a favor. Come mid-December, all 5 of the stores Izuku wanted to be built had been finished, and he had been far less embarrassed when he thanked the Urarakas for working with him this time. Knowing he wasn't the best at names, he let the respective people he hired to run them pick the building's names. Within reason, he only had to reject one name idea, but each store was quickly named and added to his neutral territory list, which included the following: an apartment complex, the SSI Shine, the community center, 2 mom and pop styled corner stores, a second-hand store, a 100 yen shop, and finally the bakery. All of those places were in the south side, and while Izuku had a few spots he regularly went to in other districts, he didn't have any claim to those places. Though he was working on it, it was so much harder to buy property outside of the south side, and Izuku's working theory was that the people in the south side had skipped a lot of legal proceedings to turn over ownership to him. He'd have to have his deeds checked and make sure he was indeed the official and legal owner of his properties, but he could focus on that next week. Right now, he should pay attention to where he was walking. He had almost tripped over one of the cracks in the uneven sidewalk. Such things wouldn't normally trip him up with how acquainted he was with what passed as a road in the south side, but he wasn't familiar with this area and didn't expect the damage since it was one of the nicer areas that weren't in his red light district purview. The only reason there were cracks in the sidewalk like that was because a recent hero versus villain fight. Honestly, Izuku wouldn't be in a neighborhood like this and much less at 4 in the morning as he was now, but Magna-san texted him saying she wanted to talk with him as soon as possible. So Izuku gave himself a cold shower to wake up and got on the first train to Sakiya Station following his GPS to what he presumed was her apartment. His brain was still foggy from only having half of the time to sleep he normally got. Izuku only remembered to leave a note for his mom when was walking down the complex stairs and had to go back to write one. So suffice to say Izuku wasn't all there and still mostly a zombie when got to Magna-san's building. When Magna-san opened the door, he noticed she wasn't as well put together as she usually was but seemed to have the presence of mind to gawk at his own dishevelment. Then again, he wasn't much better at the moment. Midori-chan? You're here? She questioned, seemingly shocked at his being at her door. You said it was important, Izuku responded, though it didn't change Magna-san's expression. Midori-chan, I texted you at like 1 am. She told him and he averted his eyes. Yeah, I know, sorry, but it's a 3-hour ride here, Magna-san. He apologized before looking back at her. What's wrong, Magna-san? You didn't say in your text. He asked. Mange-san opened her mouth to speak then closed it and ran a hand through her hair. Right, okay. Mezzo mentioned you were studying quirks, so you know a lot about them, right? She asked and Izuku blinked. I graduated back in October. Are you having problems with yours? He inquired because that would seem like a valid reason for the middle of the night text. No. Not my quirk. Magna-san quickly corrected her, hands going to hug herself. But I know someone who is, she admitted, pausing to swallow. It's bad. She confessed, her worry clear. Does it hurt them? Izuku pressed and Magna-san nodded. Izuku quickly understood the severity of the situation. He ran his tongue over his teeth hard to the point of pain in order to jolt his groggy brain. Do they need a hospital? He asked and Magna-san became slightly panicked. You can't tell anyone. He's not. Magna-san responded, trailing off as she struggled to find the right words. Magna, Izuku said, easily getting the woman's attention with a sharper tone and dropping the honorific. I work and practically live in the 38 red light districts. The people I am closest to are in gangs, the mob, or involved with both. And to top it all off, I'm quirkless. I am the last person to go to the authorities. He told her, finding himself surprisingly short on patience in his state. I do not care if your friend is on the wrong side of the law. What I care about is if he needs something I can't help with, like a broken bone. He clarified, making some of the tension leave her anxious form. Does he have any? Izuku questioned and Magna-san shook her head. No, his quirk wouldn't cause anything like that. Well, I don't think it could. He has some kind of fire quirk. She explained and Izuku was relieved to hear that. Izuku has had so much experience with burns from his bullies, mainly Kachan, and it taught him how to treat different types of burns. Alright, I can probably help with that, but if there's anything serious, I have some favors I can call in to get someone discreet to help him, okay? Izuku replied. Raijin still owed him one, or he could probably get Yuri-san to help. Criminal organizations of their scale usually have 1 or 2 certifiable doctors on the payroll. Magna-san stared at him, taken aback. Why, you can do that? She asked, her voice a touch more reserved. Your friend needs help, and I'm going to do my best to help them. He responded, glancing inside her apartment but not seeing anyone. Is your friend here? Izuku questioned. No, but I know where he should be. Magna-san answered and Izuku nodded. Okay, you're going to take me to him, right? Izuku guessed. Yeah, sure just give me a few seconds. Magna-san told him after a moment, grabbing her shoes and throwing on her coat before cursing as she searched for her car keys. Izuku didn't remember the woman having one, but that was hardly the most pressing issue at the moment. She locked up her apartment before starting to walk back to the ground level. So what's the problem with his quirk? Izuku asked, figuring he should try to get as much information as possible before going into the situation. It wasn't like he had anything else to do and he needed something to occupy his mind when Magna-san started driving. Magna-san missed a step and would have fallen down the stairs if Izuku didn't quickly get a firm grip on the railing in Magna-san's arm. Sorry Midori-chan. She apologized and they continued down the stairs at a slower rate. Don't know, we're not that close. She admitted, sounding somewhat guilty. I met him back when I was working at the Barnacle. He didn't look old enough to drink, but the prick running the place didn't care who was buying his slop. Magna-san shamefully explained, though Izuku couldn't say he blamed her that. She needed money, and her boss was definitely an idiot. If Shoji-san slipped and told him about how Magna-san was fired, well, that was something between them. I'd try to keep an eye on him when he came in so he wouldn't drink himself to death. I didn't see him that often, but when I started working at the bakery I started to see him on my way home. It was pretty obvious the kid's homeless, so I'd make some extra food for him sometimes. She confessed, bracing herself. However, Izuku was the last person who'd reprimand her for that. Hell, he was seriously considering giving her a raise. That's good of you to give him food, Magna-san. He assured, having been on the other side of self-doubt more than once. Magna-san relaxed again. It wasn't a problem. But we got to talking more in the last couple of days. He wasn't himself and I had to take him back to where he was squatting today since he couldn't walk straight. She told him, her worry coming back, and if he was that bad Izuku could understand why she was. His students were far from being on the up and up, and some of the things they did was drugs. Izuku remembered freaking out when he first saw one of his students were dangerously high on drugs. Some of his students have very intense addictions, but he tried his best to help them where he could. He's still working on a plan to help them, but that was neither here nor there. So for the short ride to the warehouse area by the docks outside of the south side, the location answered any lingering thoughts about why Izuku hadn't previously heard of Magna-san's friend. He was already putting himself to the test with the districts, much less look for more work outside of them. The building Magna-san took him to had tape saying condemned on it and was visibly falling apart in the same way most Southside buildings were. A good chunk of the roof was gone and there were holes in the walls. However, it was black scorch marks that caught his eye and had him questioning whether it was caused by Magna-san's friend. You should stay out here, Magna-san. Izuku told the woman. What? Why? She questioned, looking lost. He's a private person, right, Magna-san? He guessed and she nodded. Then it's better for whatever relationship you have if he doesn't think you went behind his back and ratted him out. He elaborated for her, and Magna-san looked conflicted. Izuku sighed. Magna-san, I can handle this situation just fine on my own. Do you think that your friend would purposely hurt me? He asked, and Magna-san reacted instantly. No. Never. She denied. Then don't worry, I've dealt with abrasive people all my life. He assured, then went to the closest hole and went inside the old warehouse. The inside looked worse than the outside, which is certainly quite a feat. Beams that were part of the roof were bent towards the floor where the hole was, and a lot of debris that was no doubt the roof or bricks from the walls, and that wasn't mentioning the black scorch marks all over the place. The whole place would have been burnt down already, but the ankle-deep black slushy water covering the whole floor and the snowstorms probably were the only reason it hadn't. Izuku heard someone sneeze followed by a bright blue flash and turned towards it. The emptiness of the building worked in his favor, and he could see Magna-san's friend, though he thought the man would be hard to miss. The guy had set a beam and some other things on fire and was trying to put it out. Izuku made his way over and Izuku helped him by grabbing a discarded bucket to dump slush all over. Crisis averted. Izuku turned to the guy and noticed three things. Firstly, he had bad thick scarring all over. Secondly, he was underweight, and thirdly, he was as sick as a dog and pretending he wasn't. Who the fuck are you? He grunted out. slightly swaying where he stood, and if Izuku hadn't spent so much time perfecting his own wobble, he wouldn't know the signs to look for. "Deku Sensei, who are you?" Izuku asked, and the guy scoffed, "Like I'm giving some random twink my name, get lost kid," he said, brushing him off, and started trudging away from him. "If you don't give me a name, I'm going to call you Scar," Izuku informed him, and the guy whirled around to curse him out. "Fuck you." But his face scrunched up and he flailed as he tried to get away from Izuku before he sneezed, causing another burst of blue flames. Izuku reacted quickly by throwing a bucketful of slush at Scar, which made a big cloud of steam and a crackle. Izuku did his best to wave away the steam. "Look, one of my kids said they saw smoke and fire, so I came to see what was up," Izuku lied, stepping through what was left of the cloud. "This is my place and I'm not leaving, so just piss off," he tried to tell him, but was cut off by the start of a coughing fit. Izuku went over to him and was going to help him, but he held up a hand covered in blue flames. "Don't come near me," he choked out, still coughing pretty bad. He nearly collapsed as his legs were getting weaker, but stayed on his feet by putting a hand on a nearby wall. Izuku ignored the hand still on fire and walked over to help him. "I said, piss off," he snarled, holding his hand up threateningly, and while it was hot enough to feel from where he was standing, he did not have the mind to care. Instead, he refilled the bucket and tossed the slushy mix at him again. There was a sharper hiss and crackle as the smaller flame was doused, and Izuku threw him an unimpressed look. Scar's coughing fit had ended, and now he was wheezing with his body trembling pretty hard. Scar was worst looking up close, and Izuku could see that his eyes and nose were red, probably from whatever was making him sick. "You're not well, just let me help you," Izuku told him. Scar was going to snap at him, but his legs finally gave out and Izuku rushed forward to catch him and keep him from falling over into the inky slush. He expected Scar's body to be warm considering his fire quirk, so he nearly jumped out of his skin when he felt Scar's ice-cold body. It wasn't anywhere near as cold as Yuri-san's, but Izuku would have easily mistaken Scar to have an ice quirk if he hadn't seen the man produce fire. He was also much lighter than Izuku expected him to be, even when taking homeless into account. "Scar?" Izuku said when he realized that the other was very limp in his arms. Upon not getting a response from him, the greenette shook Scar. "Hey. Scar? Scar." Izuku tried before sitting him down against the wall to look at him. Scar had passed out and he pressed a hand to Scar's forehead. Compared to the rest of Scar's body, it was relatively warmer than the rest of him. Concerned, Izuku hoped that he had just passed out from exhaustion or exposure, since he didn't have a good coat on. Scar needed more help than he could provide by himself. Izuku no doubt would be calling in favors, and he should probably go to Yuri-san since he'd have more resources. He also knew that the faster Scar was out of the cold, and this place in particular, the better. So Izuku took a deep breath and then carefully wrapped Scar's arms around his neck. He felt somewhat awkward as he tried to get a good grip on the taller man's thighs to carry him. Actually lifting him was a bit of a struggle, even if there wasn't cold water to make his grip slippery, and he stumbled back a few steps. Scar was easier to lift than Izuku would have thought, though that wasn't to say he was in any way light. Izuku figured the guy was around 43 kilograms, which was almost too much for Izuku, but he would manage, and started his trek back to the hole he entered from. Understandably, Magna-san was concerned when Izuku walked out carrying Scar. "What happened?" she questioned, immediately going over to him and checking them both over. "Your friend here is sick. Don't know what with, but I'm leaning towards a cold. He passed out while I was talking with him, and I don't think leaving him in there will be good for his health," he explained, continuing his path towards Magna-san's car. "Open the door for me, Magna-san. I'm going to need at least one hand to use my phone and find him somewhere to stay," Izuku requested, and the redhead was quick to comply, opening the back door, and Izuku laid Scar out in the backseat with his coat on top of him. "Give me a few minutes to find out where we're taking him, okay, Magna-san?" Izuku told the woman before walking a bit away. He pulled out his phone and went to his contacts. Yuri-san's wasn't hard to find since his phone didn't have many named contacts, then texted him. "Hey Yuri-san, are you awake?" It was still 4 in the morning, so he couldn't be sure Yuri-san would be awake, but he got a reply almost instantly. "Midoriya, what are you doing up this early?" Izuku sighed and called him to talk to him directly. "Hi Yuri-san. Sorry for calling you so early, but I need a favor," he nervously told him. "Are you okay, Midoriya?" Yuri-san questioned in the way he knew was him asking if he was in trouble. I'm perfectly fine, Yuri-san. A friend of mine needs a safe place to stay for a while. Do you have any fireproof safe houses by the south side? Izuku inquired, getting to the main point of his call. Perhaps, I'll need to check with Valentine first to make sure. Are you sure you're all right, Midoriya? Yuri-san pressed. Izuku wanted to call the man's worry for him more parental than friendly, but even if he wasn't sleep-deprived, Izuku did not have the mental constitution for figuring out what kind of relationship they had now. I'm fine. Just a little tired from being up so early, Yuri-san. Izuku assured, rubbing his arm trying to stay warm. If you say so, Midoriya. I'll get back to you in a moment, Rebanok. Yuri-san told him, and Izuku nodded. Of course, thank you, Yuri-san. This means a lot to me. He responded, thankful Yuri-san was willing to help him out with this. He waited for a few moments before Yuri-san returned. Valentine says there should be a safe house nearby. It should be on block 14 by the Niigata racecourse. Will that work, Rebanok? He offered, making Izuku let out a sigh of relief. Yes, that should be ideal, mate. Izuku answered, throwing in some Russian Yuri-san had taught him. I'll send word to my men there to prepare for your arrival. It will be building number 6 and the passcode for the door is 5847 Dita. Yuri-san informed him. Got it. Blagadaru, Yuri-san. Izuku told him, it is no problem, Midoriya. I shall still see you Saturday, yes? Yuri-san responded, and Izuku smiled as he replied, of course, Yuri-san. I'm going to hang up so I can get my friend to your safe house now. Talk to you later, Yuri-san. Until then, Midoriya. He told Izuku. He ended the call, then ran over to Magna-san to tell her where to go.